On the night of April 25th, 1944, the Royal Air Force bombed Munich, and somewhere inside the burning Bavarian state collection of paleontology, the only skeleton of Spinosaurus that science had ever found turned to ash and rubble along with the rest of the building. Nobody stole it. Nobody misplaced it in some warehouse the way it happens in the movies. It was simply gone, incinerated in a single night, and for the next several decades, everything anyone knew about one of the strangest predators to ever walk the planet existed only on paper. That single fact is the reason this animal's entire scientific identity has effectively had to be rebuilt from almost nothing. Not once, but 3 separate times. And the most recent rebuild happened so recently that it's barely 5 months old as of this video. This is the story of Spinosaurus, and it's less a story about one dinosaur than it is a story about how much can go wrong. And then right again, when the only evidence you have keeps disappearing out from under you. The story starts in 1912 in the Bahariya Oasis of Egypt, where a fossil collector named Richard Markgraf, working on commission, dug up a partial skeleton, unlike anything that had been catalogued before. He shipped it north to Munich to a German paleontologist named Ernst Stromer, who spent the next 3 years studying it before publishing his description in 1915. What Stromer had in front of him was strange even by dinosaur standards. A lower jaw lined with conical, almost crocodile-like teeth, a scattering of vertebrae, and, most strikingly, a set of dorsal spines rising up off the animal's back, some of them over a meter tall, clearly the internal skeleton of some kind of sail or hump running the length of the spine. Stromer named it Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, spine lizard of Egypt, and even from that partial skeleton, he correctly recognized it as something genuinely new, a predator built differently from anything else known, from the Cretaceous. What he couldn't have known is that this original skeleton, the actual physical evidence behind everything he'd just published, had less than 30 years left to exist. Stromer wasn't blind to the risk. As the Second World War intensified and Allied bombing raids on German cities became a real and growing threat, he reportedly urged the museum's director to move the fossils somewhere safer, out of Munich, away from a target city. The director declined, apparently confident that the Luftwaffe's air defenses would be enough to protect the collection. They weren't. On that night in April 1944, the museum was hit directly, and Spinosaurus's holotype, the one physical specimen that legally and scientifically defined what this species even was destroyed along with several other irreplaceable fossils from Stromer's Egyptian expeditions. What survived were Stromer's original photographs, his sketches, and his written descriptions. Thin, static, 2-dimensional evidence for an animal that had briefly existed as 3-dimensional bone and was now nothing but paper again. For the rest of the 20th century, that's genuinely all paleontology had to work with. An entire species reconstructed and re-reconstructed in museum displays and documentaries, based on notes belonging to a skeleton nobody living had ever actually laid hands on. You can probably guess what happens when scientists are forced to fill in a physical gap that size using nothing but old drawings for 70 years. Guesswork accumulates, and some of it hardens into assumption. For most of the 20th century, the working image of Spinosaurus was essentially a scaled-up, sail-backed version of a conventional theropod, something built along roughly the same lines as Tyrannosaurus or Allosaurus, just with a fin on its back and a longer, narrower, crocodile-like snout, striding around on land the way every other big theropod supposedly did. That picture held for decades, right up until a paleontologist named Ibrahim went looking for more Spinosaurus material in the Chem beds of Morocco, and in 2014, published a paper in the journal Science that blew the old reconstruction apart. Ibrahim's team had assembled a new specimen, a neotype, standing in for the original holotype that no longer physically existed, and the anatomy it revealed didn't look like a scaled-up Allosaurus at all. The nostrils had retreated backward, positioned closer to the middle of the skull rather than the tip, a configuration you see in modern animals that spend a lot of time with their face partially submerged. The neck and trunk had elongated in a way that shifted the animal's center of mass forward and down, closer to its knees than its hips. And most strikingly, the hind limbs were short, genuinely short, relative to the rest of the body. Nothing like the long, powerful, ground-devouring legs you'd expect on a fast-moving apex predator on land. On top of all that, the limb bones showed unusually high density, a physical trait that, in modern animals, often functions as ballast, extra weight that helps counteract natural buoyancy and makes it easier to stay submerged in water instead of bobbing helplessly on the surface. Ibrahim's conclusion, splashed across headlines worldwide, was that Spinosaurus wasn't just comfortable near water the way, say, a heron is. It was the first genuinely semi-aquatic, non-avian dinosaur ever confirmed, an animal that may have spent much of its life actually in the water, hunting the way a crocodile hunts rather than the way a T-Rex hunts. 6 years later, in 2020, the same research group published a follow-up describing the tail in detail. Tall, flexible, fin-like, and argued, it functioned as a genuine propulsive paddle, something Spinosaurus could sweep side to side to actively swim and pursue prey underwater, not unlike a newt or a crocodile. It's worth pausing here on something the more careful voices in the field were already flagging back in 2014, because it matters for how seriously you should take any single dramatic reconstruction. The Moroccan type wasn't one clean, articulated skeleton pulled from a single spot. It was assembled, at least in part, from disarticulated bones recovered from a bone bed that has produced fossils from multiple large predators over the years, and a handful of researchers raised a legitimate concern that some elements attributed to this one individual could, in principle, belong to more than one animal, or even conceivably a close relative, rather than Spinosaurus aegyptiacus itself. That's not a conspiracy theory, it's just an occupational hazard of working with a genus whose one clean physical reference skeleton had been reduced to ash decades earlier. Every subsequent reconstruction has had to build forward from a foundation that even its own authors acknowledge is more reconstructed than found. And build forward is exactly what happened next, except this time the field didn't move in one direction. It split. In 2022, two heavyweight studies landed within months of each other, reaching opposite conclusions from the same basic question, and neither one was working from guesswork. A team led by Matteo Fabri, published in Nature, ran bone density measurements across a huge comparative dataset of living and extinct animals with known lifestyles, from confirmed swimmers and divers to confirmed land dwellers, essentially building a reference chart for what dense, ballast-like bone actually correlates with in nature. Spinosaurus scored high, in the same range as penguins and hippos, animals that spend real time submerged. But here's the twist that made the study more interesting than a simple yes or no verdict. Suchomimus, a smaller, closely related Spinosaurid, found in the same general part of the world, did not score high. Its bones were lighter, more consistent with wading or shoreline life than with active submersion. The takeaway wasn't that all Spinosaurids were swimming predators. It was that within this one bizarre family, some branches appeared to have committed to a genuinely aquatic lifestyle, while close cousins on the same family tree had not, which is a far stranger and more interesting result than a blanket verdict either way. Meanwhile, that same year, Paul Sereno's team took an entirely different approach and arrived at a very different headline. Publishing in eLife, they built digital, skeletal, and flesh reconstructions of both Spinosaurus and Suchomimus, and ran them through models of buoyancy and stability in water. Their conclusion was blunt. Both animals, they argued, would have been unstable and top-heavy at the surface, and simply too buoyant to fully submerge and pursue prey underwater the way a crocodile or an otter does, no matter how dense their limb bones were. Under their model, Spinosaurus wasn't diving after fish. It was wading, standing in shallow water on those comparatively short hind limbs, striking downward at passing fish with that long crocodile-like snout, the same way a heron or a stork hunts today, an ambush predator working the edges of rivers rather than a pursuit predator working the depths. Two rigorous, differently designed studies published the same year, and depending on which one you read first, Spinosaurus was either a genuine swimming hunter or a giant wading bird analog that never actually went for a swim. And then in 2024, a further paper led by Nathan Myhrvold added more weight to the skeptical side, arguing that the bone and muscle architecture of that famous fin-like tail simply wasn't flexible enough to generate efficient propulsion the way a whale's fluke or a fish's tail does. undercutting the idea of Spinosaurus as an active underwater pursuit hunter even further. So that's roughly where things stood heading into 2025. Not a settled animal, but a genuinely contested one. A predator that had been destroyed once by a bomb, rebuilt once from scattered bones a continent away from the original find site, and was now the subject of an active tug-of-war between two camps of serious researchers, using two legitimately different methods and getting two different answers. And then, in February of 2026, the story picked up a piece nobody entirely saw coming. A 20-person team led once again by Paul Sereno, working fossils recovered from the Farak Formation in the Central Sahara of Niger during excavations stretching back across 2000, 2019, and 2022, formally described a brand new species. Not a new specimen of Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. A genuinely new species, the first new Spinosaurus species named in over a century, going by Spinosaurus mirabilis. And it came with a feature nobody had seen on this genus before, a tall, curved, scimitar-shaped crest running along the midline of the skull. The bony core of a structure that in life was very likely sheathed in keratin, extending the crest even taller and more dramatic than the bone alone suggests, not unlike the bony casque you'll find sitting on top of a modern cassowary's head. The team gave it a nickname almost as striking as the crest itself. The hell heron, a name that leans directly into the waiting, ambush predator side of the argument, rather than the deep-diving swimmer side, and that's not an accident. The fossils came from what researchers describe as a forested, inland habitat, cut through by rivers, not an open, coastal marine environment, which fits far more naturally with a shoreline waiting hunter-working freshwater river systems than with an animal cruising open water offshore. This particular individual is estimated at around 8 meters long when it died, smaller than the roughly 15-meter estimates that get thrown around for the largest Spinosaurus aegyptiacus material, though the researchers note it likely had more growing left to do. Stack the whole century up and look at it from a distance, and the pattern is almost hard to believe. In 1915, Spinosaurus enters the scientific record as a strange, partial skeleton with a sail on its back. In 1944, that exact physical evidence is erased in a single night by a wartime bombing raid, leaving nothing behind but photographs and sketches. For 70 years, an entire species exists as a kind of scientific ghost, reconstructed in museum halls and documentaries from secondhand notes rather than bone. In 2014, a new specimen from an entirely different country effectively resurrects the animal, but resurrects it as something almost unrecognizable, a short-legged, dense-boned, semi-aquatic predator that upends everything the 20th century assumed it looked like. Through the 2020s, that resurrection itself gets picked apart and argued over by dueling teams of serious scientists, using bone density charts and buoyancy simulations and tail biomechanics, none of them fully agreeing on how much time this animal actually spent in the water. And then, in early 2026, a second species turns up entirely, adding a scimitar-crested cousin to the family tree, and tilting the weight of the evidence back toward rivers and shorelines rather than open water. 3 total collapses and rebuilds of our understanding, for one genus, in a little over 100 years, and there is no particular reason to think the 4th rebuild isn't already sitting in a rock formation somewhere in the Sahara, waiting to be found. There's something almost fitting about the fact that the animal at the center of this story keeps having to be reassembled from fragments, because that's essentially the entire history of paleontology compressed into one genus. Most extinct animals don't get the luxury of a single, tidy, universally agreed upon reconstruction. They get a working hypothesis built from whatever bones happen to have survived, tested against whatever new bones happen to turn up next, revised, sometimes reversed, and revised again. Spinosaurus just happens to have lived through that process in an unusually dramatic, unusually public way, complete with a literal wartime destruction of the evidence at the halfway point. What we're left with, as of this video, isn't a finished picture. It's a predator that almost certainly spent real time in or around water, built with tools, dense bones, a long specialized snout, retracted nostrils, that only makes sense for a life lived near rivers and shorelines, alongside at least one close cousin with an enormous decorative crest that most likely never went anywhere near open water at all. Whether the original Spinosaurus aegyptiacus was diving after fish like a crocodile, or wading after them like a heron, is still, genuinely, an open argument among the people who study this for a living. And honestly, that's a far more interesting place for the story to sit than a tidy answer would be. If you want the short version, the dinosaur that got blown up in World War II is still, 80 plus years later, actively rewriting itself every time somebody digs in the right patch of Saharan rock. If you like this one, go back and check out the Nanotyrannus video from a couple weeks ago. It's a very similar kind of story, an argument that outlived the scientist who started it. Let me know in the comments whether you're on Team Swimmer or Team Heron, and subscribe to Claw Catalog so you're here for whatever the fourth rebuild turns out to be.